Good day, everyone. So today we will begin by looking at the central nervous system and looking at the structure and function of the brain. So let's begin with a little bit of review of the lobes of the cerebrum. And if you remember cerebrum, this is responsible for higher mental functions. And it's the largest portion of the brain, where it's about 80% of the mass, okay? So it consists of a right and left cerebral hemisphere that's connected internally by the corpus callosum. So let's talk about the frontal lobe, which is here in yellow. Frontal lobe is responsible for voluntary motor control of skeletal muscle, also important for concentration and for decision making. And so it's also separated by different gyri, which the gyrus again are the folds, and then the indentations, if you remember, those are the sulci. Okay. So the parietal lobe next, which is here in blue, is responsible for somatostatic interpretation and interpretation of textures and shapes. All right, then the temporal lobe, which goes to our sides in this picture, it's the pink. And so this is important for interpretation of auditory sensation and memory of auditory and visual experiences. So it works a little bit with our occipital lobe as well. All right, then we have the occipital lobe, which is found on the posterior portion of our brain. And so this is responsible for conscious perception of vision and integration of movements and focusing the eyes. And it helps to determine the where are and what that we're seeing. All right, the last lobe that we can't see within this is going to be deep to the temporal lobe. All right, so we'd have to literally peel away that temporal lobe to get to it, and that's the insula. And so that's responsible for pain, taste, and for smell or olfaction. So two important areas of the brain that we should mention, and hopefully this is review from anatomy, but the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus is going to be in the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus will be in the parietal lobe. And so these will be separated by the central sulcus, which will then separate the frontal and the parietal lobe. All right, so the precentral gyrus, this is important because it gives us a topographical representation of our motor control. Okay, so I'm going to write motor control. And so for here, we have neurons called upper motor neurons. Excuse me, I'm pregnant, so while I'm recording this. So the upper motor neurons then represent how much of our brain is devoted to certain regions of the body. All right, so here in this image, the highlighted in yellow represents these upper motor neurons as to what portion of them go to different parts. So if you look here, we have a large number of motor neurons that go to our thumbs and hands and fingers. And if you think about that, it's because we use a lot of that for touching, right? And so feeling for sensation. Also, we use a lot of muscles for facial expression. And so there's a big chunk of that devoted to those regions. Not as much though for our feet and then our lower and upper legs and pelvis. However, though, I do want to point out that we go from the inferior portion of the body, so from feet, and then it goes up, 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 all the way to our head region to do with swallowing. All right, so then the postcentral gyrus here, this is found again within the parietal lobe. This is going to be behind the central sulcus, and this is outlined here in purple. So now this is responsible for somatostatic sensation that's coming from receptors in the skin, muscles, tendons, and joints, and so it's also called our somatosensory cortex. And so this will tell you how many neurons are devoted to different sensations within different areas. So I also wanted to point out here different areas of the body. So hands, fingers, and thumbs. Again, we go around touching mostly with those. Also, our lips have a proportionally high amount devoted to it. Because they're highly sensitive regions. And then also our tongue and pharynx, which don't think about this now, but when you were infants, you put everything in your mouth, and I'm sure your parents will tell you that, because that was a source of sensing different textures. Things that we don't have a lot devoted to are like the feet, legs, pelvis, trunk. It's because you don't walk around feeling with your upper body, right, or with your back with things. So another region too, genitalia, highly sensitive region as well. So the cerebral cortex, this is responsible for higher order functioning such as language and information processing. And so the sulci, which again are going to be the indentations, along with the gyri, which are the grooves, are going together to be called convolutions. And so what we have with the structure too is that the cerebral cortex then is composed of gray matter and white matter, and then pockets of deep gray matter again. And so the gray matter, that's going to be a lot of unmyelinated axons, cell bodies, and dendrites, whereas the white matter is going to be predominantly myelin that we see within our neurons. So the brain can further be divided into different functional areas, and this is a very simple picture that I have here. Please understand that it is very complex and there's still a lot that we do not understand. But let's start out with here as to the frontal lobe. And so what we have is, again, primarily for movement, so primary motor cortex. This is that precentral gyrus, also frontal eye field. This region within the frontal lobe helps with the coordination of movement of our eyes with what we see. Also, big thing with personality, and so a lot of personality disorders. So they might be affected within this region of the brain. Here within the prefrontal cortex, what we have is planning and organization as well as reasoning. This actually isn't developed until you hit 25 years of age. And so good example of teenagers. This is why they have a really hard time with planning to meet with friends or organizing something with your family. And also with reasoning, a lot of bad decisions are made at this point. Also, a little bit of the motor movement of writing is involved, as well as with speech, and then the motor speech area here that we find. So these would be responsible for those muscles. Okay, so then looking at the temporal lobe, then what we have are primarily looking at the auditory center. So the primary auditory cortex, this is going to be the bulk of your temporal lobe. And so we try and figure out where sound is coming from, also recognition of whose voice we are hearing or what sounds are familiar to us. All right, so then if we look at then the parietal lobe, so that will be, maybe I should do a different color. All right, so parietal lobe, here we have mostly of our senses. So here was that postcentral gyrus, also known as our primary somatosensory cortex, and that homunculus of representation, how many neurons. Also association areas where we'll have integration of now speech, vision, and with our different senses too. There's some some region for hearing well that's integrated within our parietal lobe. All right, then we have our occipital lobe back here, and so primarily the bulk of it will be taken up by the primary visual cortex to understand what we're seeing. However, we'll also have processing of visual information, so trying to locate where the object is coming from, that will work together also with the frontal eye field to coordinate movement with our eyes. Okay, and then the last one again, which is deep, and so it will be right around here. Again, if you remove that temporal lobe. So that's the insula. And so what we have a big thing is for encoding memory and integration of sensory information. So it's going to work with our parietal lobe as well. And so with smell helps to receive a different sense of smells so we can familiarize ourselves and understand what we're smelling. So that also is with the primary olfactory cortex. And then we'll have gustatory cortex as well, which will be found deep here. And so that has to do with taste, and so recognizing like those different senses of taste that we have. And also is important for transmission of pain information, and then works, since it's so close to the temporal lobe, with our auditory information as well. So our brain has something called cerebral lateralization, where basically the right side is controlled by the left side of the brain, and the right side of the body is controlled by the left side of the brain. So, for instance, with the precentral gyrus, which again is in the frontal lobe, is going to control movements on the contralateral, so on the opposite side of the body, due to these decussation of fibers. So here what we have is the right side, and then this is the left side in this image. And so we'll have the transmission of fibers that are going to cross onto the opposite sides. This is true for the somatostatic sensation that occurs within the postcentral gyrus, which again was in the parietal lobe, and so we'll have opposite sides. And so the communication then between the two sides are due to this region right here of white matter called the corpus callosum. So the right side in general is going to be responsible for visual spatial tasks, recognition of faces, as well as composing music, and arranging blocks and reading maps. And the left hemisphere then is going to be responsible for speech, writing, and calculations, and understanding of music. We also have these mirror neurons that are found in the frontal and the parietal lobes, and what they do is they take both sensory and motor information and integrate the two together. And so these are going to be connected through the insula, and then to our emotion center within the limbic system, which is predominantly within the cingulate gyrus. And these are involved in learning social skills and language, and so individuals that are on the autism spectrum disorder may have problems with these mirror neurons because mirror neurons aren't firing correctly, and so they might not understand necessarily empathy and different emotions, and so there means that there would be some type of miscommunication here within the emotional center of the brain.